This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Vincent Brown. Dr. Vincent Brown is the Charles Warren Professor of American History, Professor of African and African American Studies, and Professor of Art, Film, and Visual Studies at Harvard University. He is the co-founder of Timestamp Media. His research, writing, teaching, and other creative endeavors are focused on the political dimensions of cultural practice in the African diaspora, with a particular emphasis on the early modern Atlantic world. Brown's scholarship appears in multiple media. The author of numerous articles and reviews in scholarly journals, he is also a principal investigator and curator for the animated thematic map Slave Revolt in Jamaica, 1760 to 1761, a cartographic narrative. He was producer and director of research for the award-winning television documentary Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness. He is the executive producer and host for The Bigger Picture, and producer and director of How Do You Remember the Days of Slavery? Professor Brown's first book, The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, was co-winner of the 2009 Merle Curdy Award and received the 2009 James A. Raleigh Prize and the 2008-2009 Louis Gottschalk Prize. His most recent book is Tacky's Revolt, The Story of an Atlantic Slave War, which won 8 prizes: the Ansfield Wolf Award, the Frederick Douglass Prize, the Harriet Tubman Prize, the James A. Raleigh Prize, the P. Sterling Stuckey Prize, the Elsa Gavella Prize, the Oscar Genscher Prize, and the Phyllis Wheatley Book Award for Nonfiction Research. It was also a finalist for 5 others, including the International Kundal History Prize. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Brown. How are you?
Thank you so much, Dr. Newby. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So we can jump in. I know it's the end of the semester, so time is limited. How did you get into Black studies as a field, and what makes you committed to that field of inquiry?
Ooh, okay. So what should be a pretty easy softball question for me is already going to throw our listeners maybe a curve, because I wouldn't say that I'm a Black studies scholar, at least not in the sense that I'm trained in Black studies and know Black studies traditions. I'm a historian who has been inspired and I'd say enabled by Black studies scholarship, even though I have never worked principally within Black studies. So I also, I have to admit right away that I kind of, sit obliquely to Black studies. My work is in some ways tangential to some of Black studies' main concerns, and in some ways, maybe central. So I think throughout the course of our conversation, we'll probably spend some time with me trying to distinguish myself from Black studies. At the same time, I talk about how I draw inspiration from Black studies scholarship and Black studies traditions. With that said, I would say that, for me, the most important thing about Black studies is that it's omnivorous and expansive. That its approach to studying Black life and Black history and Black politics and Black futures draws in all kinds of disciplines, all kinds of questions, all kinds of methods. And that's something that's always been attractive to me, even working as a disciplinary historian. So, one of the definitions of Black studies that I like a lot has been offered by Robin D.G. Kelly, the historian at UCLA. And he says that Black studies or African American studies tries to understand how Black people came into being in the modern world, how that process through kidnapping, enslavement, the extraction of labor, the extraction of ideas was foundational to the modern world. And finally, the way that African people and their descendants tried to remake and re-envision that world through art, through ideas, through social movements, through literature, through study in action, right? So right there, you see how expansive that vision is. It starts with a historical problem. How are Black people made in this world, right? Through the conditions of slavery and colonialism. life under capitalism, but also how have Black people responded? How have they met that predicament, and all of the expressive traditions then that Black people use to meet their predicament in the context of slavery and colonialism and life under capitalism become objects of study, become our subject of study, and that to me is a kind of a kind of analysis that's made to measure the actual world of Black people, to paraphrase Césaire. And so, working within that larger context, I have kind of broken off a piece of it for myself, which is the disciplinary historical study of Black people, but drawing my questions from that larger range of Black studies.
Okay, thank you. I think it's really important that you are very clear on your relationship to Black studies and how you think about being a historian, but taking some of these questions from this major, expansive project of Black studies as a whole. I do want to ask what got you interested even in that piece of it, right? So, being a disciplinary historian that has written award-winning books on slavery in the Atlantic, what drew you to that specific topic or trajectory of inquiry?
Well, maybe I can start by talking about it again expansively and fundamentally. So I think what drew me to Black studies wasn't necessarily a reading of Black studies scholarship at first. It was, my introduction to, I guess, what Robin Kelly calls study and action through Black arts, right? So I, was a child of the 1970s. I was born in the late 60s, grew up in the 1970s during the Black Power movement and the Black arts movement. And so the kind of, the efflorescence of creative expression that was emerging from Black people all over the world, but in the United States in the 1970s, is what really introduced me to this larger world, right, of Black study. So through things like funk music, through things like reggae music, through the Black arts movement and poetry, and we should acknowledge the passing yesterday of Nikki Giovanni, one of the giants of the Black arts movement, but also of Black study more generally. So my first understanding, grasping that life as a Black person was A, beautiful, B, interesting, far more interesting than I was going to see in anything in the mainstream media, and that we were doing it for ourselves, thinking for ourselves, creating for ourselves, practicing new kinds of politics. All of that came to me through the arts. And so when I think about the various, careers that I thought I was going to have, or was as you're a child when you're growing up, we just think, what do you want to be? What I wanted to be first was a visual artist when I was young, because I used to like to draw a lot. And I would draw, like these kind of Black Power cartoons and things like that in the 1970s. And then I wanted to be a writer in middle school. And I would write stories. And often my stories were about Black people and their struggles. And then, when I was in high school, I studied theater and I thought I was going to be an actor. And so I went to college, actually, to University of California, San Diego, to study performance. And there I studied with Luther James, who was one of the first Black television directors in Hollywood. I also studied with Floyd Gaffney, who was a dancer and choreographer and theater director, who both of whom were very invested and engaged in the Black arts movement. And I remember one of the first scenes I did was a Leroy Jones play, right? The Dutchman. Mm-hmm. And so, already kind of my engagement with Black studies was there through the expressive traditions that were being, worked out in the Black arts movement. And then by the time I decided that I wanted to be a historian, all of those questions, right, all of those concerns were already there. And so very naturally, by the time I chose a discipline in graduate school, Black studies had shaped me as an intellectual, far more fundamentally than if I had just gone out and read Black studies scholarship. So I did a minor in African American studies, or I guess it was African and African American studies at Duke University, where I did my PhD in the 1990s, finally completing that in 2002. And I guess I can add to that a little bit, which is that throughout my career, I've always kind of had a project that was mostly straight down the line, print historical, often using methodologically conservative approaches. But I've also tried to work in the arts, in media, in film and television alongside that. And those projects tend to be far more informed, I think, by as I said, the disciplinary omnivorousness of
Mhm.
Black studies. So in graduate school, I was working on the dissertation that became my first book, The Reaper's Garden, which was a story of early African American culture in Jamaica. Um, and and in order to research that, I wound up spending a lot of time on the theoretical and conceptual material that had really worked out what early African American culture was like. And one of the people who had done a lot of that work was an anthropologist named Melville J. Herskovits. So I was reading a lot of Melville J. Herskovits. And for listeners who don't know, he was an anthropologist working in the early half of the 20th century. And when he began working in the late 1920s, people assumed that the slave trade and slavery had denuded Black people, Negroes at the time, of
Mhm.
any ancestral heritage they might have from Africa. And so he worked most of his career, early part of his career, trying to document formal cultural connections between Africans and African Americans, right? And what he would do is he would take a lot of notes, but record a lot of audio of stories and songs. He would shoot film. He shot film of people, say, dancing in West Africa in a way that lined up, corresponded to the way people might have danced or moved in the Americas. And what he would do is he would take the footage from Africa and the footage from the Americas, and when he juxtaposed them, he could see a kind of history of cultural connection. So, the cinematic method was kind of at the foundations of his own research method, and I thought, oh, that could make a really interesting film. So I kind of broke off in my Black Studies way, right? Thinking about Melville J. Herskovits and how I could make a film about his work that corresponded with or grew out of my dissertation, but took a radically different form. So I would say in my work in expressive traditions, I'm far more a Black studies scholar, maybe even than I am in my history work, though they inform each other.
That's so interesting to think about the ways in which the expressive tradition of Black people and in Black studies is so integral to thinking and informing the other types of inquiry that happens. So which made me think of a question that I want to ask you that isn't necessarily one of the questions that I pre-sent you.
That's
Um,
okay. We're in a state of nature. We can talk about whatever we want.
But I wanted to ask about some of the methods and the paths of inquiry that you use, specifically like in thinking about like with Tacky's Revolt and the cartography that was used in that. And I know you've talked about considering what technology can afford us. Like, what can we use from these different mediums to tell a story that maybe written word doesn't allow, particularly when we're thinking about archives that were created at a particular time for particular purposes that completely left out the voices of the oppressed. So when you think about the types of methods that you're using, what is it that drives you to a particular method or allows you to think more expansively about what can be used to tell these stories, given that you are like a disciplinary historian and that is a more conservative field methodologically?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a great question, and I would say the way I get away with it, the way that I pull off the heist of using various media to tell my historical stories, is that I focus on the question. That if the question I'm asking is historically relevant, then I feel justified, and I can convince my peers, even my most methodologically conservative peers, that anything that helps me answer that question in a satisfying way is a legitimate method, right? So if I can convince them of the legitimacy, the relevance of the question, then they got to follow me through my various methodological turns in order to come up with the answer. And we can argue, we can talk about whether or not that's a satisfying answer. What we can't do is say, because you don't have a traditional set of sources, because you don't have a print record from, produced by the powerful, none of your answers are legitimate. If the question is legitimate, let's talk about what kind of answers we might come up with and how we might get there. So for me, it's always like asking the kind of, what is the subject, right? Why do we care about the question that I'm asking? And then how do we get there? And then we can work out how we get there. So, that's at the abstract level. Specifically, you already mentioned the word, which is medium, mediation. Any question is going to be answered through the mediation of some kind of source, some kind of evidence. Mm-hmm. And I've been really interested in how we mediate these subjects, right? Because I think about media a lot. The form that any kind of story takes is already, on my mind. Now, again, I think this is something that's been a concern of Black studies scholars from the beginning, which is why we've been so expansive in our concerns. But I guess I should try to make that specific. In the first book, my question was, look, we know that these slave societies, especially in the Caribbean, were very high mortality societies. They were brutal, they were deadly, life expectancy was short, people were dying faster than they were being born. And we knew this demographically. Uh-huh. What we didn't know is what that meant culturally. And so my question was, in such a context where people are dying so fast, where death is an overwhelming fact of life, and in that context where we have thought a lot about how it is that, say, Africans become African Americans culturally, what they call creolization, how people kind of come to know the codes and conventions and life ways of their new world. What did the fact of that demographic catastrophe imply for that cultural transformation? So that was the question I asked. And then I had to figure out kind of how would I know culturally what the demographic catastrophe of Caribbean slave societies meant to people. And so the question was then, how is that mediated, right? I thought, well, one of the things, and this was kind of from my reading on death and history and anthropology, is that people actually form relations with the dead, with their ancestors. Mm-hmm. But those relations are immaterial, right? We can't exactly know kind of how those relationships function, but they're mediated through different kinds of practices. And so the question became, what are those practices and how do I study them? The same thing happened with the Tacky's Revolt book, which is we didn't have a lot of information on the intentions of many of these slave rebels. But what we could do is track their movements and see if we could infer something about their intentions from the way they moved across the landscape. So I trained myself to think more like a geographer and cartographer in order to study movement and what movement implied in terms of the intent, the strategic intention, and the tactical knowledge of these rebels. And so the mapping that was fundamental to the argument of that book really emerged again from the question that I asked. And I think that historians all agreed with me that we want to know how and why these people engaged in this rebellion as they did. And the rebellion I wrote about was the largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire, happened in Jamaica in 1760. And so they can debate what my methods are, but they couldn't debate my question. And I think that they had to accept that I had something to say that maybe hadn't been said in the same way before.
That's a really informing and useful point. Like the debating of the methods comes secondary to but is the question worth asking? And if the question is worth asking, then that mediation process, that's a conversation, but we're still going to ask the question because we're going to ask the question.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whatever needs to come to help answer that should be up.
And you can say that's not an important question, right? if you want to. But if I've got a lot of people who want to know the answer, that's an important question.
Yeah. And I think that definitely gets to the heart of so many so much of Black studies, but also so many of these conversations have been come back to the questions. Like, it's about the questions that you're asking and the methods that will help you to answer that question, regardless of the field or discipline that they might be most used in.
Exactly. And I mean, and what happens when you start with the method? When you say, okay, our questions have to be constrained by the given methods of analysis, is if we don't have the right sources for writing history, right, then all the questions that emerge that can't be answered by those sources don't matter, right? Therefore, if we don't have sources that we already recognize as sources for intellectual history to study Black people, then Black people don't have an intellectual history.
Yep.
We already know that's BS. We already know that's BS. So if you ask the question, how do we study Black people's intellectual history, right? Given the absence of those traditional sources, we got to find new sources. And this is something that Black studies scholars have been doing over and over and over and over and over again. And then, you know, traditional disciplines have to catch up. I mean, there's a great kind of like, I forget who said it, but there's an understanding of methodology that holds that, look, all disciplines have so here it is. All methods of analysis tend to turn their own limitations into standards of evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which is, you know, if I'm a quantitative scholar, anything that I can't count doesn't count. That all becomes noise to my method. And then I'm going to judge everything insufficient to the degree that I can't subject it to a quantitative analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like, we already know that's bizarre, right? So I don't know. So I think starting with the question is far more important than starting with the method. And then, as you say, the methods will follow, you know? Free your mind and your ass will follow. The method being your ass.
Yeah. Very, very true. Building on that, how does all of this, right? Starting with the questions, the use of the methods that are going to best help you to answer the questions, or at least infer answers to questions that are unanswerable completely at this point. How does that also impact what you do in the classroom and in like the history workshop that you run at Harvard? Like, how does that inform pedagogy and teaching?
Well, that's great. So I have a workshop that I've been running for the last dozen years, I guess, called History Design Studio at Harvard, that emerges from some of the media work that I do. And the genesis of that idea was, in some ways, just the way of working on the Herskovits film, which is, you know, I got to a certain point in my research where I thought I could probably keep working on this by myself, cobble together a shoestring budget, and make the thing. And then my parents would watch it and I could force my friends to watch it, right? Or maybe I could scale it up. And I happened to have the good fortune of meeting the director, producer, Lou Allen Smith, at a party here in Boston around that time. And he had just left WGBH and he was starting his own documentary company. Now, he had, you know, started his career as an associate producer on Eyes on the Prize with the Black Side Group. So, you know, he was about the most accomplished documentary filmmaker I would have been able to find. And I pitched him on the idea and he liked it, accepted it. We made the film together. I stayed on as producer and director of research, and he became producer and director, and we made it with his company. And the film was fairly successful. We won a prize from, you know, film festivals, and we won a prize from the American Historical Association. I thought, okay, so here's a model for working, you know, across different fields, right? Me as a historian, academic historian, him as a documentary filmmaker, where we made something that, you know, the filmmaking community could admire, the history community could admire. We didn't feel we'd compromise too much, and it worked, right? And I thought, well, maybe historians can work then as producers, where, you know, we don't have to do everything in the project. What we have to have is a vision for a project. What we have to have is a sense of where the project should go, of the questions again that we're asking. And then we have to learn how to collaborate with people who have skills we don't have, the filmmaking skills that Lou had that I didn't have, right? Or in the Tacky, the cartography project, the map making skills and coding skills for cartography that I didn't have, but I could raise those questions with those people, and we could work together and collaborate and produce something, a multimedia project that satisfied the concerns of historians, but also was aesthetically satisfying for people who look at maps or watch television programs. So History Design Studio had its origins in that discovery, which is that historians could be producers, as opposed to just say talking heads who kind of appear in films. We could actually be shaping the interpretation and the trajectory of a story and its argument in a way that's different when you just give an interview and then, the filmmaker, who may or may not be a historian, may or may not be a Black Studies scholar, may or may not be concerned with the questions you're asking, is shaping the argument and interpretation. So History Design Studio tries to get, people interested in history to think more like producers, to take seriously, right, sources and interpretations, to engage communities of interpretation, like what historians would call the historiography, but I think is much broader than that, which is everybody who cares about history and argues over history's meaning and how the story should be told. But then to expand beyond the print medium, to think about how, history can be told in art installations, in videos, in cartography. So just to get people thinking, more like, I guess, museum directors have always thought about public history, which is how can we tell these stories in various different ways that are going to reach audiences who are accustomed to learning history from their music, from podcasts, from video, etc.
That's so interesting. And I think important in this moment, especially, but just in general, thinking about like, how are we going to tell stories that people are going to consume in multiple ways?
Yeah.
Because, in the academy, you're telling your story to a very select group of people. And sometimes that select group of people is students in your class who have to read the readings that you assign. And sometimes it's other academics who are maybe interested in the questions or saw the question and want to critique the question itself. So they read you. But thinking about the ways that multiple populations and communities can have access to a story and what it means to produce something that has a broader facing audience than what's in the academy, I think is not only super important for Black studies, but just important in general.
This gets back to your emphasis on the medium and the question of mediation, which is, look, even in your classroom, you have various ways of getting your point across. You may have the things that you've written, you have the things that you've assigned, you have your lectures, you have your discussions just with your students. Beyond that, right? Yes, your academic books may reach a very select audience, and if they're written simply to produce knowledge for specialists, that will be a particular audience of specialists. But then you may extend beyond that and have different kinds of projects that reach different kinds of audiences. So I tend to think of our academic production in terms of a media ecology. And I think academics should be far more engaged in various aspects and various platforms within the media ecology, right? So there's no reason why academics shouldn't extend beyond journal articles and books and make films and videos if they learn how to collaborate. I think that's the way we should be working. In part because it's not just a matter of either or. It's not that people don't read and so we have to make video. It's that those little videos that we make might draw people into the literature, right? Might raise questions that can only be answered by the literature, because these different forms do different things well. There are a lot of things that a book can do that no other form can do. So books are going to remain a great platform for getting information across. The kind of depth that you can get, the kind of the endurance of the form of a book, I think is really important. Where some of the other things we do, they go away, right? Things we do on the World Wide Web may be obsolete in 5 years. People may no longer be using whatever platform we thought we were designing for. So I don't know if you're designing something for TikTok, I don't know how long that's going to last. You might get it out there and it might reach more people immediately than your book will last, but I think your book, in your library is going to be around for longer. And so we shouldn't be so quick to discard that as an outdated technology. So I very much believe in writing and producing books and journal articles, especially for our specialist audiences. But I also think that there are other ways to reach people, and each of these media have their kind of natural range and scope, and also their natural half-life in a way. Like I said, books I think have a much longer half-life than some of these other platforms. But when I made the Herskovits film, I learned this, that we got our audience numbers from PBS after its premiere, and it turned out we had reached 800,000 households on a single night of its premiere. Now, my first book, which did pretty well, which came out at the same time, I think maybe sold 3,000 copies, right? 800,000 households versus 300,000 copies, right? But, the book lasts longer. The book has, I think, had probably more influence on scholarship, certainly in my field, than the film did. So just reaching a wide audience on a single night doesn't necessarily make something more important, right?
I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this question. So in thinking about the different mediums that information can be disseminated by, shared, stories can be told, and in thinking about the History Design Studio and the getting grad students and historians to think like producers, what is the role of the audience in that? Like, is there a consideration of who you want to reach with this? And does that shape how the methods that are being used to tell the story at a particular time?
Yeah. I'm a big believer in you generating the questions, the arguments, and the stories that are really important to you and that motivate you. And I tell all my students this. I mean, you're not going to do your best work if you're thinking of the audience first. You're going to do your best work if you're trying to work out something that's important to you, or that stokes your imagination. So that's the first thing. But then, of course, you want to recognize the possibilities and the limitations of reaching a particular audience. A story that I always like to tell is I saw some tribute program a long time ago to Martin Scorsese, the film director, and Steven Spielberg was making a tribute. And he was talking about being the producer of a remake of Cape Fear, the movie. There had been an old black and white film, and Spielberg wanted to hire Martin Scorsese to direct a remake of Cape Fear that was going to have Robert De Niro. And Scorsese said, yeah, I saw the old version, and it's about this kind of perfect family that's threatened from the outside by this villain. And I want to update it by making it so the family is riven from within. They've all got all kinds of internal fractures and fissures that make them vulnerable to the outside. So it's not a kind of perfect American family, but a dark family with all kinds of struggles and tensions. And Spielberg says, you're Martin Scorsese and I love you, and I want you to make this film, but that's going to cost us 40% of the gross. And what he knew, being Steven Spielberg, being one of the premier commercial filmmakers of his generation or any other, is that certain kinds of stories reach certain kinds of audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect American Family threatened from the outside has a larger audience than a family that makes you think about families in a different way, that makes you struggle with like our notions of family, that ask difficult questions that are not comfortable, that are not easy to assimilate, right? If you're asking those difficult questions in the stories that your scholarship is telling, right, versus kind of offering something that's far more easier to accept, far more palatable to an audience, right? That's going to cost you a certain audience. So you can tell the difficult stories to one size of audience and the simpler stories to another size of audience, right? As Jay-Z said, I dumbed down my lyrics and I doubled my dollars, right? They criticize me for it, but they all yell holla. right? So like this is just something that's kind of known. So when you think about an audience, to get back to your question, you got to think about how important is it to you to tell a certain kind of story. If it's really important for you to tell the complex, difficult, challenging story, you have to expect that's going to have a smaller audience. Probably, just choosing a different platform isn't going to fix that for you.
Mm-hmm.
But B, maybe you speak to a different set of people who are influential in a different way. So sometimes these most challenging stories that ask the hardest questions, you're better off speaking to a small community of specialists who are then gonna kind of change the way they think and then reach out across their particular networks to reach ever broader audiences of people. You don't necessarily have to reach a broad audience by yourself all the time. Influence works in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, thank you. I was trained by a lot of rhetoricians, so audience is something
Okay.
that I'm always thinking about. And then I taught writing for.
So tell me what you learned. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think what you said makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's not necessarily about the size of the audience; it's about who you want to reach with the story.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you are trying to reach a small group of specialists who might have more power to enact change in other networks and other areas, that's one thing versus telling a simpler story that might reach a broader audience. And maybe that will lead to more interest in some of them. But it might just be that they learn this piece of information today and they move on with their lives tomorrow.
That's possible. Or maybe you can kind of take something that's palatable enough, that's familiar enough, and tweak it in a way. Just to kind of, just enough, and be like, that raises a question I didn't have. And now I got to go someplace else. And I very much believe in that too. Another filmmaker story. I was reading Alfred Hitchcock's interviews, and he said that, he was he was the pioneer of the thriller genre. He practically created it. He also was a formal innovator in cinema and just what he did with the camera and the way he told movies. And what he said was that anytime he wanted to do something really challenging with the camera, to do something that was going to be unfamiliar to an audience, he always put like a beautiful woman in the shot. Something that was going to be familiar to people and that they wanted to see, going to be palatable, and they would stay with the confusing and complicated and novel and innovative shot in order to look at the beautiful woman, right? And that way he could give them, what he called that was the jam around the pill, right? The sugar that makes the medicine go down, essentially. And there's a way of working that's like that too, which is like, look, you can kind of give people a narrative that's conventional enough that they know how to follow your story, but within that more conventional narrative, you can often be offering some very challenging ideas. I tried to do this with Tacky's Revolt. So Reaper's Garden, my first book, is a much more thematic book that asked the question about kind of, what did death mean in the social lives of people enslaved in Jamaica in the 18th century? And it was broken down into thematic chapters. Tacky's Revolt is much more narrative. It's a military history that proceeds chronologically. But within that, I'm trying to do some challenging things that are not conventionally done within military history and maybe not done within even the thematic work on slavery. So I think that book, probably reached a larger audience than it would have had I just made that an analytical argument and not made that, narrative storytelling.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I definitely think that the role of telling a story in research is so important. And that's one of the things I talk to my students a lot about. Like, what story are you actually telling? Because whether or not you look at it like that, like that's what you're doing. You're telling a story of something. So what story are you telling? And what does that mean for not just what you're using to tell that story, but what are the impacts, the potential impacts of this particular story being told in this particular way?
Amen.
I want to ask about, two things. One, what interests you most about the past of, and you can talk about like history, like as a disciplinary historian, you can talk about like what interests you most about the past of like how history has been done, how history of Black communities has been done, whether that's positives or negatives that exist around that trajectory.
Oh, that's a good question. and my answer might get me in some trouble. So here we go. Which is, I was trained at a time in the 1990s when social history was ascendant and transnational history was ascendant. And so, I came into the graduate history program at Duke when there were a lot of Black students studying the civil rights movement and the history of slavery. And so what you had there was a kind of critical mass of people who were studying the Black freedom struggle from the slave trade to the Black Power movement, all talking together. And I mean, we had people there like, Chuck McKinney and Paul Ortiz and Hassan Jeffries and so many others. Stephanie Smallwood and Alex Bird and Herman Bennett and Jennifer Morgan. And we had all of these people, right, who were engaged in this conversation. So the first thing was there was no half stepping in this conversation, right? If you wanted to talk in these conversations, you had to bring your A game. You had to do your studying, right? You had to understand the questions that were being asked and come with your perspective on the best way to answer them. So that was fantastic. And we all had this sense, I think, that, social movements make the world go round, that studying that long trajectory of Black politics from slavery through civil rights was our way of understanding the history of Black communities and the future of Black communities. So recently, I've noticed, and this is the part that might get me in trouble, there's less of an emphasis on Black social history and Black studies conversations. More of an emphasis on the logic of white supremacy that limits and hems and prevents Black life chances. And that to me feels a bit alienating. So I'm not particularly well versed in the literature and the scholarship on Afro-pessimism, but Afro-pessimism as a mood, I think in some ways obscures a lot of the history of Black people and their struggles by overemphasizing the logic of white supremacy and the logic of anti-Blackness. And so, this, like I said, this is the part that might get me in trouble, which I don't engage it very well. It doesn't interest me very much. I'm waiting, and maybe this is just because I'm old school. I'm kind of waiting for us to get back to Black history. Maybe we never will. Maybe it's all gonna be white supremacy all the way down from here on out. But I feel like I will re-engage with Black studies more energetically when the Afro-pessimist mood has passed.
That's real. I one of the, and I want to make sure I get their name right. There's a book that I use in my classes, in my Black culture class. It's The Politics of Black Joy. It's by Lindsay Stewart. But in it, she talks about how she puts Zora Neale Hurston into conversation with Beyonce, but also in thinking about how Hurston was so intentional about focusing on Black people. The white gaze is not important here. It's about Black people, what Black people think, what Black people are doing, and not putting that into conversation with whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about this idea of the refusal of neo-abolitionism, or this continued focus on the oppression and the pain and the hurt of Black people having to be the predominant story and narrative that exists. And I think that that's, I teach it because I think it's so important that it's not about Black people in conversation or Black people through the lens of white people. It is, we need to study Black people for Black people. And whether or not that comes into conversation with whiteness is irrelevant. If we're really thinking about the culture and the trajectory of Black people and Blackness in the Americas.
So I admire that because, one of the things that frustrates me sometimes is when all of Black life and culture becomes a reaction to white supremacy or to white power and what white people do. And, as I read it, again, from my early interest in Black studies as cultural expression through my historical study, Black people aren't just reacting, we're creating, we're inventing. we're working out, new modes of life in this context, right? And so it's not as if the context isn't important, but for me, the, reacting to white supremacy isn't the most important thing. It's the creation, it's the struggle, it's the organizing, that I find far more compelling. So one of my favorite books that's coming out next year is a book by a historian at Brandeis University, a guy named Greg Childs, called Seditious Spaces. And he's working on what's called the Taylor's Conspiracy, which was a conspiracy of enslaved and free Black and brown people and some white people, um, to overthrow slavery, to resist racism, and maybe even to take down the Brazilian state in 1798, influenced by the Haitian Revolution. And what he does in that book is he takes like their thinking about their political predicament seriously, not just their reacting, right, but how they're organizing and how they're disagreeing with each other. Some people are resisting racism without wanting to overthrow slavery. For some people, it's about, overthrowing slavery altogether. For some people, it's more about, resisting the state or transforming the state. So kind of really taking Black politics seriously and thinking about what a Black public looks like is really exciting to me. Because then it's no longer just another philosophical meditation on the nature of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, but it's, hey, what are Black people doing and how are they doing it? And what are the possibilities for their succeeding as Black people in the future?
That's one, I wrote down that book. So I'm very interested to read that.
Seditious Spaces by Greg Childs, coming out from Cambridge University Press in 2025.
I will be grabbing that. But yeah, I think you're right. Like the focus on white supremacy and the positioning of what Black people do as always in reaction is disheartening and problematic. But shifting that and not putting, because it puts whiteness back at the center. I are we doing that again? So yeah, I think that you're right in that having that not be the overwhelming focus is really important for the type of work that we can do in Black studies. You kind of touched on this, but I'm going to ask the question anyway, just to see if there's anything you want to add about what excites you about the future. Or maybe what questions do you think are important or interesting for us to ask moving forward, whether that's in history and thinking about history as a set of questions that you can use different methods to answer, or Black studies?
That's a great question. And yeah, I'll draw on some things that we've already been discussing, which is one of the things that excites me most is, the way in which Black studies scholars, and especially, in the case of the scholarship, I know Black studies scholars working in history are reaching out beyond the academy. Now, that's not something that's obviously brand new. That kind of goes all the way back to the earliest traditions, where it started outside the academy and worked its way in, and now it's working its way back out. But thinking about how it is that, these kinds of stories get outside the classroom and get outside the circulation of specialists, I think is really important. Now, I think we've been helped by the success of people like Henry Louis Gates Jr. in shaping public conversations about Black people. And I think that we've been helped by the recent importance of Black politics in the street, Black Lives Matter, and other movements. So, by engaging both what we can do in popular culture from universities, but also engaging like Black political movements outside of the academy altogether, I think there's a real possibility to create a new public conversation around Black people, our historical expressions, our culture, our struggles. But of course, that's not, that's fraught, right? It's vexed, and it's under threat right now. In some ways, our reaching out beyond the academy is going to be compelled by the fact that, I'm just saying this speaking from Harvard University over the last year or so, it's pretty clear that we are not going to be defended at elite universities when the attack comes over the next 4 or however many years. We're going to have to find ways to defend ourselves. And I think part of that, maybe most of that, is going to be building constituencies outside of university administrations. I do think that the success of Black Studies scholarship, probably since the 90s, has owed in part to convincing university administrations that we were going to be on the leading edge of diversification of the university, right? If the university is de-diversifying right, over the next few years, right, convincing university administrators is going to be more difficult. We're going to have to re-engage the public that cares about these questions already, that is asking these questions in ways that we're not always giving compelling or satisfying answers, right? If we can re-engage that conversation, we can build a constituency outside the university and have some leverage within the university that I think is going to be diminishing over the course of the next few years. That's a complicated way of saying that our power is not within the universities.
Yeah.
Our power is in speaking to communities outside the universities, and we need to do that with more urgency.
Well, thank you. I agree. That's something that has definitely been on my mind a lot lately, even before the election, just thinking about the attacks on Black studies, direct attacks on Black studies, and the ramping up of that across different states. And now the forthcoming attacks and the fact that, institutions are not going to protect the field. That's not.
Yeah, I think a lot of these university leaders have shown themselves all too willing to obey in advance.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. So one of the things I think we need to do is convince people that, any of the questions you have, let's just take the United States for this example. Any of the questions you have about American history and what's important to you, right? You need Black studies to help you provide answers. So if you're thinking about freedom, you really need to be thinking about slavery and the people who had to fight for their freedom against long odds. If you're thinking about capitalism, you should probably be thinking about people who were owned as property, right? In fact, who were the most valuable property in the mid-19th century US, right? As the United States emerged as a world economic power, right? If you're thinking about democracy, well, you probably should be thinking about people who were denied the franchise until very late and who are under threat, right? Whose voting rights are under threat even now. You can't really think about freedom, capitalism, or democracy without thinking about Black history, without thinking about Black struggle. I think that way of approaching the question, which is anything you might want to understand cannot be fully understood without the study of Black people, is our way of reconnecting with those broader conversations in the public.
That makes sense. So thank you.
Thank you. This has been great.
No, it has been very informative, and I greatly appreciate all of the generosity in your responses and the insight that you have dropped. It's making me think about more things. And we recently changed the name of our department. So even just thinking about what are the implications of that, and what does that mean for how we're thinking about Black studies and our curriculum moving forward are all things that are going through my mind. That really.
What is the new name?
Now it's African American and Africana Studies.
Okay.
We're African American Studies. So
okay. We are African and African American Studies at Harvard. Yeah.
And that's what Michigan State was, African American and African Studies, which is where I got my PhD.
Oh, all right. Okay.
But is there anything you would like to add?
Well, let's talk about rhetoric for a minute.
Okay.
What are you working on? And what are you teaching your students about rhetoric from the perspective of Black studies?
So right now, what I'm working on is really thinking about pedagogy and how do we teach Black studies? In terms of rhetoric, so I was very fortunate to be trained and to have the influence of a number of rhetoricians like Dr. Geneva Smitherman, and then her student who was then my professor, Austin Jackson. Denise Troutman. There were several, Adam Banks, who I worked for at Stanford. There were several rhetoricians who have been very influential in my life. And a lot of the research I did in grad school was around rhetoric and Black language and stuff like that. So in teaching writing, I always taught it through Black studies. And now in teaching and being able to be in a Black studies department and teach Black studies content, I'm still like also teaching writing. Like, let's talk about audience. Let's talk about intention. Let's talk about purpose. Let's talk about like language usage, because words mean things. So that's a huge thing in my classes, is like words mean things, and the ways in which Black people have been talked about, the ways in which Black people talk about themselves. Like, what does that mean? What are the implications of the framing of these issues? And what does that mean for who it reaches, but also for how we think about these issues and addressing them moving forward. So that's
so important. And it gets, I mean, we have a lot more to say. We could do a whole other hour just on mediation and form and rhetoric and aesthetics. But yeah, I think that's so important. That's so important because, you know, whatever your idea is has to come across, right? And it comes across in the way you form those ideas, the manner in which you speak, and the manner in which you write, and the manner in which you put images and sounds together, and the manner in which you move. All of those things are rhetorical gestures which frame the meaning of an idea, which convey the meaning of ideas. And we don't get there without thinking about how we craft our rhetoric.
Yeah. I feel like that is a point that is not as, there is a lack of understanding of that sometimes among students. And I'm still like working through and thinking through like, okay, how do we get students to value and to understand that like what's happening here rhetorically is just as important as the content that's being conveyed, because the way that you're consuming it, the way that you're interpreting it has not only to do with your background and your understanding, but also how it was framed and where it was put out and who its intended audience was, even if you're the person consuming it right now.
Those are vital, fundamental questions that I think we all need to be thinking about. And yeah, the fact that too often people just let those questions slide, they think they're not important, they think they're irrelevant, that's a problem. That is a problem.
I mean, that's why we have all this misinformation and disinformation. It's like, where's the media literacy and the ability to really think critically about who is saying this and what is the reason that they're saying it now and in this way. And
right, and it's getting worse as algorithms pick up the faulty, the fatal, the compromised data, and then turn those into assumptions that are going to get swept into artificial intelligence. That's I mean, you know, if we're not thinking about that, we're not thinking about the way we interact at all. You know, I was listening to an interview with the writer, poet, Robin Cost Lewis, and she was saying that at one point she was writing in a text, maybe, Black interiority on her phone, and the autocorrect changed it to Black inferiority, like 3 times. It was like, oh, the autocorrect is like, oh no, Black interiority is not a thing, but Black inferiority, that's something I recognize. That's a familiar phrase, right? This is already happening to us again, right? And if we're not paying attention to that, then, you know, we're going to be, again, starting behind the mule. So,
yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I hope you have a happy holiday. And let me know when this comes out. I'll be eager to listen to it and post it on my social medias.
Well, that will be appreciated, and I will definitely let you know.
Okay.
Once again, thank you so much for your time and all of your responses. I know that this episode is definitely going to make a lot of people think differently and deeply about these questions and where we're going from here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Thanks.